The world came together to fight global warming with the historic Paris Agreement on climate. But now President Trump wants out, weakening, possibly even destroying the agreement. Meanwhile, Africa is the region most at risk. And while scientists talk of consequences that will be seen in 50 to 100 years, Africa sees those effects right now. Hello, I'm Carol Pineau. Welcome to our special series, Africa and the Trump administration. It sounds like a disaster of biblical proportions. Constant droughts across huge stretches of land, wells drying out, intense heat waves, floods, life-threatening storms, rising sea levels, hunger from widespread crop failures, groundwater becoming salinized, and mass deaths of cattle and grazing stocks as savannas become parched from no rain. That's what global warming has done and will continue to do throughout Africa. This isn't a problem that Africa caused. Less than 4% of the world's carbon emissions come from Africa. Take out South Africa with its mining and Africa's major oil-producing nations, and it's less than 1%. And yet Africa will feel the effects of global warming, perhaps more than anywhere. We have a great group today to talk about the issue. We have Roger Mark D'Souza, Director of Population, Environmental Security and Resilience at the Wilson Center. We have Cher Mbo, the Executive Director at START International. And we have Marian Tupy, Senior Policy Analyst at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us. Thank you very much.
So, Sheikh, maybe we can start with you and talk about what is happening on the ground in Africa.
You almost touch base on many of the issues, which is, the effect of climate change in Africa. But I'll just try to separate one important issue just to highlight the magnitude of climate change in Africa. That's the issue of food security. Food is the bottom line for livelihood. But yet, with climate change, rainfall is declining. That put into jeopardy the most productive land that feeds African communities. And, when we talk about food security and food insecurity, we always relate it to water. And water scarcity is a big issue. Water is also a source of energy. So climate change affects, a great deal of livelihood, both in urban and rural areas, and affects the most, basic resources like water, energy, and forest resources, which is the basis of livelihood of most communities. So it affects all compartments of society, and therefore, becomes a great threat for the African continent more than anywhere else.
You talk about food security, but indeed security itself is being threatened with this. You work quite a bit on that, don't you, Roger?
That's right, Carol. And what we found was that overall, there are more than 20 global climate change hotspots in the world, and 15 of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. So we know that globally, climate change serves as a threat multiplier to interact with other variables around governance, weak governance structures, questions around corruption and misuse of funds, the ability of civil society to engage, and how that may interact with other factors such as population dynamics, young and unemployed men, and whether that leads to displacement and whether they get involved in terrorism or terrorist activities or conflict. So there's not a direct connection, but we look at the degree to which climate change and changes in the weather have an impact on these variables to result in these kinds of impacts. And we know that there are a number of conflict hotspots on the continent where climate change is exacerbating factors that lead to conflict.
So, Marian, you are with the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank. You had told me earlier your organization is sort of lukewarm on climate change. It is not denying it, but perhaps not as gung-ho as some of the others.
With regard to climate change, we have to be very careful about not ascribing everything that's going on in the world to climate change with only very tenuous links between the two. In Africa, the greatest problem is poverty and also good government. Take Zimbabwe, for example. Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa. It has produced tremendous amounts of food, which then exported to the rest of the world. But because of the government's attack on private property rights, on the farmers, expropriation of farmers without compensation. Agricultural productivity has collapsed, and that country now faces famine. Now, that famine was created by man. So my argument would be that hunger is really a byproduct of political violence and bad economic policies in many African countries. Somalia, Zimbabwe would be perfect examples, not necessarily climate change.
To me, it's really difficult to sustain the argument that climate change is not explaining some of these poverty factors and some of these food insecurity issues in Africa. It's quite risky to say so. Poverty will have implications on climate change, and climate change will have implications on poverty. In Africa, migrations are not related to people fleeing the low productive land because of short rainfall. So we have to see ways we can connect your argument with the strong argumentation of climate change impact on societies and see how much we can get a big picture, holistic approach that give us a solution-based, I say.
And I would just add to that, when people lose their opportunities to earn their living and provide for their family, that is very often when it provides for instability. And I think this goes back to your question with regards to President Trump. There is a security dimension that is important if you're looking at climate change issues and impacts. And I think it is in our interest in the United States to recognize that what happens on the continent from a security perspective is linked to a changing environment, whether you call it climate change or climate variability. And at some level, we need to pay attention to that.
If I may, on the subject of urbanization. Urbanization is taking place throughout the world. There's a massive movement of people from the countryside to the cities. Now, some people see behind it climate change or climate variability.
Yeah.
What I see in it is that people are searching for better jobs in the cities. We have seen that happen in Western Europe during the Industrial Revolution. We are seeing it happening in countries that I'm familiar with, like South Africa, for example. I think that the main driver behind urbanization is actually a different set of aspiration by Africans who want to move off the land into the cities where the better jobs are.
That's a good point. But if you see the demographic transition in Europe that make people move from rural areas to urban areas, it was because of industrialization. This demographic transition did not happen in Africa. There was not that industry that could absorb all the labors coming from the rural. Those people was forced to move. It was the push factor was higher than the pull factor because that was climate change impact in them on their livelihood. They have no other choice. I'm from Dakar and I was teaching environmental sustainability in the campus. And I took them in the West landfill to explain the demographic profile of those people. Most of them are just going from unproductive land to come and recycle, trashes for their livelihood. They came to become guardian. There was no other job than doing those kind of things. So the demographic transition in Europe cannot be compared with Africa. This is totally different story.
Industrialized nations got rich while polluting, and not just polluting in their own backyard, but the entire globe. So who pays the cost of cleaning it up now? Reducing emissions has a cost as well. Africa is striving to industrialize, but now environmental standards must be met, making it harder for Africa to compete. The world needs clean air, but is it fair that others got to industrialize on the cheap, while Africa has a higher hurdle to jump over? Again, who pays? When I look at the numbers, they really are pretty staggering. That so little of the effects of climate are caused by Africa, and yet so much of the result is happening in Africa.
About 80% of the global pollution is under the hands of few countries globally. So the rest of the countries are not contributing much.
Like 3 or 4 countries, right?
Yes, exactly. It's less than 5 countries.
What is it? China,
yes.
US,
yes.
India,
EU 28, and
Russia.
Yes, exactly. Those are the countries who really have, dish out a lot of CO2 in the air, creating all the change in the temperature. So, in terms of solutions, you mentioned Paris Agreement, and the point I want to make here is, for the first time, the negotiation on climate has been developing a bottom-up approach. What should we do in each different level to achieve that objective? And each country comes with a set of options. And those set of options are, for the first time, temperature target related to adaptation target. Again, development related to climate objectives. So nothing is imposed. And from that pledge, you aggregate it. If US pull out from this, who would pay and invest into these greenhouse gas emissions? It's a global problem. Who would invest into the technology transitions, especially in developing countries? You know, we need clean air. You just mentioned it. Who would support adaptation? You know, the adaptation gap is about 300 trillion US dollars. The amount of money we need to respond to climate-related impact on poor countries is that magnitude. Wow. Look at the UNEP report on that. And now we're having the biggest countries who are polluting the most or withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. There is a moral responsibility here. So there is no way we can just separate the linkages between climate change in one place and climate change to other places. It's all linked.
So Roger Mark, how should this be distributed and what should Africa have as far as competitiveness?
So I think who pays ultimately, it's an agreement that recognizes internationally there's a need for collaboration, there's a need for sharing of financial mechanisms such as the Green Climate Fund, but there's also recognition of Africa-specific initiatives that are trying to find ways to spur Africans into innovative approaches to dealing with this complex set of issues.
You know, these funds have been very important in being able to fight climate change, but Marion, you've actually written about some of the weaknesses of these funds and concerns that you have.
The problem is that the poorest countries in Africa and the countries which are most likely to suffer from any kind of change in climate are also the countries which are worst run and which have the worst governments. Yeah. So now you have to make an argument, or you, I mean the Paris negotiators have to make an argument to the United States Congress, which appropriates money from the American taxpayer, that we are going to send additional billions of dollars to countries where we have absolutely no idea where that money is going to end up in. I think it's a non-starter in the Trump administration.
It could become like an ATM for dictators.
We have money is fungible. Money is fungible. We know that if a government can get aid money, it will stop, say, for example, spending money on healthcare or education, and will use that money in order to purchase arms, in order to suppress domestic opposition, and so forth.
Yeah. Just to follow up on this, I think this is a really good point. We have to make sure that those funds are accessible and are well managed. It does raise the question of governance and what's the role of governance and institutions that need to be built up to manage these questions.
As a scientist on climate change and an African, I want to ask you though, Africa was not industrializing when everyone else was industrializing and polluting. Couldn't we say that Africa needs to pollute a little bit because it needs to industrialize?
That's the right they have to pollute a little bit that create all this mechanism. There's so many good technology, clean energy, and these are good opportunities for funding actually climate change, the green jobs, solar energy, trying to decarbonize some of the polluting industries, etc. So by having that, we will cut our emission. At the same time, we put the economy on the path of development that is needed for each country. Africa is not part of the problem, but is part of the solutions. We can contribute to reducing emissions, we can contribute to carbon sequestration, and that's where we need investment. If the countries who are polluting are conscious that helping some African countries can be a great deal of the solutions, because we have the forest, we have the land for agriculture that can be sustainable, then I think the rhetoric would change on how we can engage Africa in a better way by having the right technology, the right investment for the right people.
Economic growth should be the alpha and the omega of government policies in those African countries. I think that to worry about CO2 emissions out of Africa, and I'm not saying African governments do that, but for Westerners to worry about Africa producing CO2 emissions is perverse and immoral.
Africans are not sitting idly by. Many African leaders have been forward-thinking advocates for addressing climate change, both in Africa and around the world. They are integrating climate change adaptation into their national plans, installing early warning and disaster risk reduction systems, and pushing to leapfrog into clean, renewable energy. But is it enough? With drought across 17 countries, putting more than 38 million Africans at risk, and climate refugees dramatically increasing throughout the continent, so much more needs to be done. Your organization helps to grow a generation of scientists in Africa that are concerned about this. What is happening on the ground with this?
What we're trying to see is how to increase interest, engagement, and investment into adaptation. We have reviewed 170 NAPAs, which is National Action Plan for Adaptation across West Africa, and try to categorize them by, sector and by investment. Obviously, the first sectors that comes are agriculture and water, followed by energy capacity building is in the far end, But at the same time, if you take it in terms of dollar amount per project, the average project is only $300,000 for 3 years. If you take the average length of those projects, it's only 3 years. So low investment, low duration, commodity-oriented, no capacity building. And we think there's a big caveat, a big gap in there.
What is keeping them from being higher dollar and longer term?
That's right, many things. The pledge that the international community has made to put on adaptation never came. The second problem is that the poor countries, they do not budget it enough investment on adaptation, because the priority on health when an Ebola crisis comes in, you cannot invest a lot of money on solar energy. Education is a bottleneck. There's so many priorities that, climate change priorities are not really where the big chunk of the money is going. So, and that's the kind of things we need to put on the negotiation table on the climate convention to say, look, the adaptation gap has shown there is a big gap in terms of investment which is needed for adaptation. How do we go about it? Everybody has to put a check on the table to make sure that the poor countries who are suffering from the climate change they did not create it get enough share of it.
What we have found in working with partners all over the continent is when there is early involvement in the community and the local beneficiaries, that when money dries up for small-scale adaptation programs at a community level, that those programs continue because there is community buy-in.
Absolutely.
So there are lots of local initiatives that involve communities and beneficiaries early enough that allows them to continue when international sources of funding dry up.
Let me follow up on that. The money from the West is simply not going to be there. We are seeing dramatically aging populations in Western countries. We have unfunded liabilities, many times the annual output of Western economies, 400% of GDP in terms of money that we have promised to our own pensioners that we don't know where they are going to come from. Our debts in the West, as a percentage of GDP, are higher than they have ever been, or rather since the Second World War. The notion that Europe is going to, or the United States are going to be pushing as much money into Africa, as was the case in the early 2000s when the global economy was growing at a very rapid pace, I think is fanciful. I think there is going to be a decreasing amount of money flowing in official aid. So what Africa needs to do is to attract private investment. I'm afraid I need to tell to my African friends, you are on your own. The Western government money is going to dry up because Western governments are already bankrupt in the long term.
Let's take some questions from our viewers, starting with Enoch from Accra, Ghana. What measure does Africa have to take for Trump to notice Africa and how climate change is affecting us? So, Ryan, if I can ask you, what does Africa need to do to have this administration see what it needs? It is, there's been a 30% reduction in the EPA, 30% reduction in foreign assistance within Trump's proposed budget.
I don't think it should be Africa's goal to get on Donald Trump's radar, because it implies that the United States has the keys to Africa's development, Africa's future. Africa should be so lucky that it's not on Donald Trump's radar, that it can do its economic development and its political development on its own terms. We must depart as soon as possible from this notion that somehow economic and political development in Africa is a result of something that happens in Western capitals. Yes, right. It happens because of domestic pressures, of domestic political economy, demographic evolution, and so forth. So I would encourage my African friends not to look to Donald Trump and the United States for answers. After all, you have been looking to the West for answers for half a century, and not all the answers have been the correct ones. Not all the results have been the correct ones.
Yes, very much so. Miriam from Arlington, Virginia asks, what are African scientists and environmentalists doing to solve the effects of global warming in Africa? Sheikh, this is obviously for you and all that you do at START International.
Right. There are many things that can be done, and I will try to break it down in 3 levels. The first level is the individual level. We need a critical mass of scientists addressing climate change and trying to influence decision-making, trying to bridge science and policy. The second level is developing capacity for institutions to have programmatic approach on climate change, to have it in different sectors, but also to have an integrated approach in government. In a context of our government system where agriculture, forest, water, energy are all separated in different ministries, having a coordination between those sectoral development aspects to join hands on the effort of improving climate change responses is a necessity, it's not an option. And that's the institutional aspects.
Isn't this actually what was done to combat AIDS years ago, where
yes.
every ministry would have someone who was working on AIDS?
Right, on some areas that, it's really applicable. But on climate change, what I have seen is really some kind of scattered approach in different ministries. It's not harmonized, and that creates really the bottlenecks which we are facing. The third level is the networking. There are so many good, think tanks, research organizations, which are not only in one country, but in several countries. We can learn more from the other networks within Africa or within developing countries than we can learn in France or United States or Germany, because the problems are similar. There are more brain sharing in Africa than it has ever been in the world. And now with, mobilization of people, the willingness of policymakers to listen to African scientists should come into that picture. And by having this inclusive approach, I think we can transform the continent quite easily, because we have youth, we have good universities, and they're increasing in their ranking in quality ranking, in the Shanghai ranking. And what needs to be done is a bit more investment, increased laboratory and observations on climate to improve African knowledge on climate change.
Do I sense a climate scientist who is an optimist?
I'm very optimistic. I'm always optimistic.
That's wonderful.
Absolutely.
And from Michael in the Bronx, New York, climate change affects us all, but why can't Africa just move on without the help of the U.S. in solving this? Besides, there are other countries helping out. So, Roger Mark, you see so many of the complexities of this issue, and there are other countries helping out. What do you think will happen, with our leaving the Paris Agreement? What will happen as far as this? What should Africa do?
I think Michael asks a very good question. We have to look at this from a position of geopolitics. What will happen with other countries' investments and support of the agreement, particularly China? And this is very significant because China is very present on the continent and looking to increase their presence and investments. And there are certain parameters in which a Chinese investment is occurring on the continent. So from a geopolitical perspective and a diplomatic perspective, the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement actually plays out on the African continent with regard to Chinese investments. So this is one area that we need to pay close attention to.
Somehow, in every discussion here, it always comes back to China. That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you so much to my guests, Roger Mark D'Souza, Shekam Boom, and Marian Tupy. To our viewers in Africa, America, and around the globe, thank you so much for joining us.